Good evening. If I can have your attention. Great to see you. I'm Craig Sandler. I'm the Vice President of the Lexington Historical Society, and in that role, it's a thrill and a delight to see you all and to welcome you all to the headquarters of the Historical Society here at the Lexington Depot. The Society is also thrilled to be partnered with our good friends at the Lyceum Associates and ABCL to present tonight's important talk by a terrific author and speaker. I will just quickly say that it's the case that along with America, the Historical Society, as venerable as it may be, the Historical Society has plenty of catching up to do in terms of telling the full story of America, trying to accelerate to keep up with or get pace with the true arc of history. It's one step at a time, one event at a time. This is one such event. We're indebted to the Lyceum Associates and ABCL for making it happen. And with that, I'll turn it over to John Suber of the ABCL. And thank you again all very much for being here at our headquarters.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jonathan Zuber. I'm the president of the Association of Black Citizens of Lexington, and I'm happy to be here with you as a co-sponsor for this event, along with Lexington Lyceum Advocates and the Lexington Historical Society. Thank you very much for having us. Frederick Douglass stands as a giant in the Black community, as one of the leaders of the abolitionist movement, and a major supporter of equal rights for women. He's also featured as one of our honorees in the Black History portrait banners that you may see around town at the end of January and through February, also known as Black History Month. So thank you. And with that, I'd like to introduce Kathleen Dalton of the Lexington Lyceum Advocates.
Well, when we were planning this event, one of the things we wanted to do is to share some time with two of our mentor institutions, which is that we, as a group, the Lexington Lyceum Advocates, are trying to get the stone building in East Lexington reopened, renovated, and to make it a center for historical learning, but also to be a community building place for meetings, for intergroup dialogue, for many, many things. And we've been in this conversation about the stone building with the town. The town owns the stone building. We're urging them to reopen it. We have high hopes for that process. Who has helped us the most? Well, I can say that ABCL helped us from the very beginning. Sean Osborne explained Lexington politics to me and taught me and my husband a lot about the basics of Black history in Lexington in 2020. We also have relied on the Lexington Historical Society and their resources again and again. The Robbins papers are really important. They have wonderful archivists. We love them. And so these are two of our foundational friends. I just want to say special thanks to Mary Keenan, who is very much a factor in the Lexington Historical Society. She's chair of the Collections Committee, and she's written the book that everybody here should go out and read about the stone building people. They're abolitionists. They've got Lucy Stone and the women's rights folks coming. They have an African-American formerly enslaved person who lives with them after a while. They have a rich and complicated history. And the person who wrote this wonderful book is sitting in the audience and has been really helpful to us. So let's give Mary a big hand. So part of our challenge is to tell the whole story of the stone building in the context of Boston abolitionism, the Black community in Boston, and how they came out here to Lexington. Lexington itself was a place where abolitionists were in danger. We have no evidence so far of attacks on abolitionists here, but they certainly were killed in other places and attacked and told not to speak in the churches. So what did it mean when Frederick Douglass came to the Baptist Meeting House and the Normal School to meetings here in Lexington in 1844? It meant that one of the really important leaders of the national Garrisonian abolitionist movement thought that the local Lexington folks were worth visiting. And it's clear that Lexington was an important local center of abolitionism. Not the most important, but one of the really reliable centers. And so that's one of the reasons the Stone Building should be reopened, and we really hope that you all will come with us to the celebration when it does get opened. I want to introduce another member of the research committee of the Lexington Lyceum Advocates, Dr. Robert Bellinger, who is a scholar of Black history and Africa, also so many other subjects, I can't list them all. He's written about monuments. He has really helped us in programming. He's going to give our introduction to David Blight.
Thank you, Kathleen. And thank you to the Association of Black Citizens of Lexington, the Lexington Lyceum Advocates, and the Lexington Historical Society, 3 organizations that I have worked with and have been involved with over the years. Good evenings and greetings to everyone who has joined us here this evening. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce to you David Blight, the Sterling Professor of History and African American Studies at Yale University, where he has been on the faculty since 2003. Let me first start with a personal story. I first met David when he was hired as an assistant professor of history at Amherst College and for history and Black studies in 1989. I was a member of a group called A5, the Amherst African American Alumni Association. And since we were based in Boston, we were close in proximity to the college and were thus actively engaged in working with and advising the college on how best to navigate the waters of diversity. When we learned that David had been hired, we were interested in finding out who he was and what were his plans for reinvigorating the Black Studies program at the school. Some of us, like myself, had been majors in Black Studies, so we had a vested interest. We requested a meeting with David, which he agreed to without hesitation. During the meeting, I was impressed with his calm demeanor and his willingness to engage in conversation. He was not only interested in hearing what we had to say, but he valued our perspectives. I was also impressed by his professionalism and his way of thinking about history. By the time our conversation had ended, we knew that the Black Studies program was not only in good hands, but in the right hands. And he did a great job during the 13 or 14 years that he was at the college. Now for some of his professional information. As mentioned earlier, David Blight is the Sterling Professor of History and African American Studies at Yale University, where he has been on the faculty since 2003. In 2004, Professor Blight became director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. In this capacity, he organizes conferences, working groups, lectures, and many public outreach programs regarding the history of slavery and its abolition. Significantly, he also administers the annual Frederick Douglass Book Prize, awarded for an outstanding nonfiction book in English published on the subject of slavery, resistance, and/or abolition. Before his tenure at Yale, he taught at North Central College in Naperville, Illinois, Harvard University, Amherst College, my alma mater, and he was also senior Fulbright professor in American Studies at the University of Munich in Germany in 1992 to 93. At the start of his teaching career, something that really resonated with me. He was a public high school teacher for 7 years at Flint Northern High School in his hometown of Flint, Michigan. Having been a high school teacher and having a spouse who is a high school teacher, I understand the importance of high school history. And starting a career there really gives you a perspective that few things can. In 2012, Professor Blight was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and delivered an induction address, The Pleasure and Pain of History. I'm hoping I'll get to read that address at some time because I love that title. He was elected as a member of the Society of American Historians in 2002 and served as that society's president in 2013 and 14. Blight works in many capacities in the world of public history, including serving on the boards of museums and historical societies. His board of trustees and advisory memberships include the New York Historical Society, the Benjamin Franklin Papers at Yale, the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, the National Civil War Center at Tredegar in Richmond, Virginia, Executive Board of the Organization of American Historians, the Board for African American Programs at Monticello in Charleston, Virginia. And he also served on the Board of Advisors to the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission and is involved in planning numerous conferences and events to commemorate the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. He was also a member of a small team of advisors to the 911 Memorial and Museum team of curators. David Blight's contributions to public history include his work as a consultant to several documentary films, including Death in the Civil War, the PBS series Africans in America, and the Reconstruction era. He has also provided important insight into the ways in which the history of the Civil War era has impacts on the present in the documentary film, Birth of a Movement, which I also had the privilege to appear in. A scholar in the fields of the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, African American history and American culture and intellectual history, Professor Blight has also had an active writing career. He has written 6 books and has co-authored and edited at least as many. He has also contributed many articles to collections, newspapers, and scholarly journals. In 1989, the year I first met David, was also the year that his first book, Frederick Douglass's Civil War, Keeping Faith in Jubilee, was published. In the introduction, David said, Douglass is missing from all major works on the intellectual history of the Civil War era, and stated that one of his goals was to give Douglass his place in the literary and intellectual traditions that the Civil War fostered. I think it is safe to say, David, that you have done that admirably, particularly in your most recent book, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, written in 2018, which has been called the definitive biography of Frederick Douglass. The book has won 8 book awards: the Pulitzer Prize for History, the Abraham Lincoln Prize, the Bancroft Prize, the Parkman Prize of the Society of American Historians, International Association of Biographies Best Biography of 2018, LA Times Best Biography Prize, New England Booksellers Best Nonfiction Book for 2018, and the William B. Stanton Award for the New York Civil Forum. And from what I read, the book has been optioned by Higher Ground Productions and Netflix for a feature film. In reviews, the book has been described as a thoroughly human portrait, which ultimately serves to clarify the greatness more effectively than hagiography ever could. Another review said that Blight introduces readers to the complex way that Douglass used memory, history, and oratory skills in pursuit of freedom. One other said that the book manages to be both a celebration of the remarkable life and a sober reminder of the many ways in which our terrible times are shaped by those Douglass lived through. In so many ways, the central question then are the central questions now. This is a feature of David Blight's work as a historian. He not only examines the past, but through his writings and many projects, he brings that past to the present. He asks us to think about the important events in our history, not only as they occurred, but as they have resonated over the years to impact us today. To understand that history, The past is always with us. As a Congolese proverb says, life is lived forward, but understood backwards. It is with this in mind that it is my honor and privilege to invite David Blight to the podium.
Thank you, dear Bob. Hope that introduction didn't wear you all out back there. You got a little energy left. And a special thanks to Kathleen, two dear old friends. Bob showed how far back we go. Can you imagine your first act as a young professor at Amherst College, and it actually turned into friendships, wonderful conversations through the years, was to go to I remember it as the 40th floor of a downtown Boston building, a law firm. You weren't in the law firm, but your friends were. And they wanted to know, who the hell is this young white guy they just hired out at Amherst? And before I left that night, we were just having a robust, fascinating conversation about history. Whew! Survived. I figured, hell, after that, I can probably do anything at Amherst. Anyway, and Kathleen and I go back a long time as well to fellowships we held here and there. Lots of events. It's a great pleasure to speak to the Lexington Historical Society. It's hard to think of too many other towns in America where the Historical Society stands for something everybody knows or thinks they know. But now you're getting deeper and deeper and deeper into Lexington's history and its surrounding, and I congratulate you on that. You don't need me to tell you that the term democracy is flowing off our lips all the time now. I joked at a recent gathering of the program committee for the Organization of American Historians, where for my sins I have to be the next president. And I said, I think we ought to, just for humor, put out a little bumper sticker for the convention that says, honk, if you're not writing about democracy. The committee didn't think that was a cool idea, actually. No. Well, so we're not going to do it. But many of you know, there's a democracy forum and a democracy conference and a democracy X, Y, and Z everywhere now. And we are worried about it for very good reasons. John Randolph in Virginia, slaveholder, famous slaveholder, in the wake of the American Revolution said, I love liberty, but I hate democracy. That says a lot. A lot of Americans throughout our history, and it appears a great many millions of them still, love their liberty. But democracy is just way too hard, or too threatening, or just too difficult. Louis Brandeis, the famous justice, said the fitting remedy for evil counsels is good counsels. Well, it was in an essay about democracy. And wouldn't that be nice? The answer for evil is goodness. Okay. They taught me that in Sunday school, I think. There are a million people we can quote about democracy, and everybody is right now. If you look up, keyword searches now, democracy is like the top of the list. But what is it? One of my favorites is Walt Whitman's. I mean, it's all over Whitman's poetry. I mean, my God, read Song of Myself, or read his poem called Oh, Democracy. And Whitman, in 1,000 ways, basically said, democracy? It's making sure that my fellow human has everything that I have. And he said it many different ways, making sure my fellow humans have all the possibilities I have. That's why it's so hard. But what is democracy? And I'm bringing this around to Douglass, don't worry, because he talked about democracy in some ways every time he spoke. And I can't believe I'm in a railroad depot from the 1850s, which means he would have stopped here. He rode through every major town. If the railroad went through a town in Massachusetts, he rode through that railroad depot. Trust me, everywhere. So I'm thinking of his top hat on as he gets up. But you said he spoke here in 44. He was only 26 then. He was a kid. Is democracy the closed, self-governing community of ancient Athens? Is that our model for democracy? Which was one where you dared to break social norms like Socrates did at your peril. They had democracy, but they had social norms, and you didn't break them. Or is democracy the kind that came in the form of popular sovereignty in revolutionary Paris? About 1792? That was very short-lived. Those of you who know your French Revolution, that was very short-lived. But they had a moment of real popular democracy for a little while until the guillotines came out. Is democracy the early United States Republic of free individual white men under a fledgling written constitution, which is a pretty new thing in the world, drawing on the natural rights tradition, deeply on the natural rights tradition, and making historic compromises with slavery because they had to in order to get that constitution? To some degree, we're still that democracy. But that Constitution became, as I'll show in a moment through Douglass, at least two different constitutions, and effectively, after the Civil War, a third one. Or is democracy, or should democracy be with the European socialists, the parties created in late 19th century Europe, where they developed a robust conception of the social compact? You know, remember way back when you may have been taught something about a social contract? What people owe each other as citizens? What governments owe people and people owe governments? What a fantastic idea that was. It's what the United States was trying to model during our progressive era with, ups and downs. Or is democracy, the kind that came out of the world that World War I broke? The world that World War I destroyed? Where the monarchies and the empires basically seemed to just die in that war, and out of it came new aspirations for democracy? Less autocracy, more democracy. And in Weimar Germany, they were creating a pretty good one. They really were. They called it a democracy. But it was vulnerable, of course, very vulnerable. And that one ended in disaster. Is democracy what the New Deal in the United States imagined out of the Great Depression? A new imagination of the social contract, a new form of American-style social democracy that ever since the New Deal, and the New Deal wasn't perfect. I was raised by two parents, one of whom grew up on farms in the New Deal and blamed FDR for everything. Farmers believed FDR was the problem, because my dad's farm family, dirt poor, went through 4 farm foreclosures in the 30s. They hated Roosevelt. My mother, who grew up in the city, was the son of a German immigrant, original member of the United Auto Workers, and he thought Franklin Roosevelt was the son of God. And in my grandparents' house, they had a portrait of FDR on the dining room wall, and Jesus was off in the parlor. And my parents always, canceled each other out with their votes because one blamed part of that social democracy. Anyway, one blamed FDR, one loved FDR. I remember once asking my mother, Mom, was that FDR on the dining room wall in Grandma's house? She said, well, of course. Who else would it have been? I said, well, I don't know. Or is democracy now, do we want a democracy that somehow that democracy that came out of the utter and total destruction of the Second World War? Democracy now understood as some kind of universal aspiration for human rights? And when the world got its first, at least public definition in 1948 of human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, memorialized in that Article 21 of the United Nations Charter. We've had such a difficult history with that too, haven't we? The United Nations commitment to democratic ideals is a huge achievement. But everyone claims to represent a sovereign people. And you can't kill sovereignty. You can't kill nationalism. Although scholars like to think, we always want to think that nationalism's just going away, this nation state stuff. We're going to live beyond that. Really? Have you looked around? The greatest changes, and this is where we get to this Civil War period and Mr. Douglass. The greatest change, this is unfortunate, but I don't come the bearer of perfect news. The greatest changes in the history of democracy and liberal thought, if you will, came out of revolutions, war, great social upheaval, and great cultural collisions. That may not be big news, but it's worth thinking on for a moment. The French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the Age of Revolutions, transformed how the world practices, thinks about, struggles with the idea of democracy. The revolutions of 1848 in Europe, the Republican revolutions, challenging monarchy. They didn't succeed very well, but they happened. And oh my God, did they leave legacies. The American Civil War, a very big conflict right there in the 1860s. And in a real sense, the whole world was watching. Could this American republic actually survive? Part of Great Britain was praying and wishing and hoping that it didn't. Part of Britain was hoping that it did. And a whole lot of other countries were dividing up on both sides. And oh my God, then there's the Franco-Prussian War, a war Americans don't learn much about, but God, what a bloody affair that was in 1870 and 71. The French got slaughtered by the thousands and defeated, and were left with a terrible legacy they came to call revanche. They needed revenge, and it would really affect the next generation that would face the First World War. And of course, the Great War, World War I, which is hard to study, isn't it? It's hard to even think about. Now and then we get a new movie about World War I, and we once again learn about its absurd, disgusting, unbelievable scale of slaughter for reasons that are hard to discern. But the world completely came apart in the Great War and somehow had to be put back together. And I've already said, the New Deal, responses to the Great Depression all over the world, social upheaval, forced people to ask again, so what is democracy? and on the ground in our own society. Think of something like the Civil Rights Revolution, an upheaval like few others in our history, and look what it did to our democracy. Look what it did to our Constitution. Look what it did to law. And how we even think about American citizenship, and how we have fought over its legacy ever since, and we are fighting every day in the courts to either save it or turn it around and ruin it. How about the Cold War? Look what the Cold War did to our culture of democracy. And when the Cold War ended, remember? Oh, it's going to be the end of history. Shit, who needs history anymore? The great power conflict's gone. Soviet Union just collapsed. It's a Pax Americana. How long did that last? Never. Say never. And God knows, where do you want to go next? 9/11? War on terror? Trumpism? Whatever, however you want to define that. And its various kinds of authoritarian threats to democracy. They love liberty. They hate democracy. And we don't have any clue yet what these two huge wars in Ukraine and Gaza and the whole Middle East will do to conceptions of democracy, where democracies will live or die. Douglass. Now, I don't mean to be so instrumental about this or just, pluck Douglass out of the 19th century and just fit him into our problem of democracy. But boy, he has a lot to say about our problem of democracy. And Bob hinted at this in his introduction. I don't know if that was from reviews or where it was from, but one of the most astonishing things to me, and I guess I should have been prepared for it, is when I published this book and I was doing all kinds of book talks and book festivals, and then pandemic came and I thought all that was over, but that actually led to more book talks and more book groups because everybody went online, and I was doing book clubs and nursing homes. I'm not kidding, they're cool. They read. I didn't say you read, they read. No, I'm not kidding. I mean, it's amazing. Book clubs all over the country, and people would say, why does what happened to Douglass seem so current, Professor? And I kept getting that question. And pretty soon I had to answer it. I couldn't just bat it away and say, I'm just a historian. I don't know about the present. Well, just listen to Douglass a little. In the midst of the crisis, it's the winter of 1864, and if you know your chronology of the Civil War, that's a pretty terrible moment. It's the eve of the presidential election and the party conventions, and somehow they're going to try to have a general election in the midst of civil war. No republic had ever done that before. The war is really in a stalemate, and it's going to be an even more horrible, bloody stalemate by summer, spring and summer, especially in Virginia and Georgia. And it's a long way from over, and the casualties have mounted now into the hundreds of thousands. There's terrible war weariness in the North. Southerners are more than worn out from slaughter. But it's a new war. It's now a war for emancipation. It's a war, with conflicting motivations to destroy slavery. It's a revolution fought in the form of a civil war. And Douglass decides that's hopeful. And he says, February 1864, quote, "The most hopeful fact of the hour is that we are now in a salutary school, the school of affliction." This is a very biblical notion, which is very common for Douglass. If sharpened signal retribution, long protracted and overwhelming, can teach a great nation respect for justice, surely we will be taught now and for all time to come. A school of affliction. Well, it's a very Christian, although many other religions employ the same idea, that it is only through great contradiction and conflict and often blood that the human being learns and maybe finds redemption. There's so many quotable lines from Mr. D. I just want to use this one because this very day, this afternoon, we being a group of 5 historians, led by the great Jill Lepore over at Harvard, we've submitted an amicus brief to the Supreme Court about the Colorado case, the Trump v. Anderson case, which is the Colorado Supreme Court's decision to take Trump off the ballot. The Supreme Court hears oral arguments on February 8th. Today was the deadline. Last week was the deadline for amicus briefs for the Trump side, and today was we're not on the Trump side. Today was the deadline for amicus briefs. Today, they have designated days you turn them in. I'm learning a lot about amicus briefs. And it's only going to have one Douglass quote in it. This one got taken out by my esteemed colleagues, except David, nope, you only get one. That's it. And as you know, Section 3 of the 14th, I'm sure you do by now anyway, isn't it amazing the constitutional education Americans are getting right now? Thank you, President Trump. Well, he may not know he's giving this education, but he is. Anyway, Section 3 of the 14th is the disqualification clause for those who engage in insurrection and who had taken an oath to the United States government shall never again serve in office. And what we've done with our amicus brief, by the way, is we've done a kind of a straight ahead narrative, descriptive historian's take on how did Section 3 get into the 14th Amendment? Where did it come from? What are its roots, origins? What does it say? What did it do? And a little bit of its consequences, just staying in our lane. This was Jill Lepore's idea. Well, actually, it was the law firm in Colorado's idea, and they called Jill, and Jill thought it was a good idea, and now we have 4 other people signing on. Drew Faust, James McPherson, John Witt, my colleague at Yale in the law school, and Jill and me. But anyway, so we're trying to be very careful, and we put this thing through lawyers put you through so much scrutiny with every word you use. But the quote I didn't get in was this one. And it comes from the fall of 1866. The 14th Amendment is passed through Congress after an enormous debate in June 8th, 1866. That fall, and the 14th Amendment is, of course, not just section. It's like Section 3 of the 14th Amendment has been reborn. It had been totally forgotten in history. It was like dead. And now it's like everybody's talking about it. The 14th Amendment's greatness, of course, is in Section 1. You live under the 14th Amendment. You live under Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. And it may be one of the few reasons we've kept this republic together. Section 1 of the 14th Amendment is the one that gives us birthright, citizenship, and equality before law and due process. Take that out of our Constitution, this wouldn't be working. But my God, suddenly Section 3 matters because we had an insurrection on January 6th. In the fall elections of 1866, it was an off-year congressional elections, but extremely important because Andrew Johnson, who wanted a lenient, rapid Reconstruction with no changes in the Constitution. Just wanted the Southern states back in the Union. Don't mess with the Constitution. But the Republicans, the original Republicans, take the 14th Amendment out on the road, and they made the election of 1866 a referendum on the 14th Amendment. And Douglass, in a private letter to Charles Sumner, says, "Until redeemers come from the pit of hell instead of paradise, until the temperance cause can be left to rum sellers, the freedmen cannot be left to the care of their former masters." Now, we took that out of the brief, and for good legal reasons. That's not about disqualification for violating your oath of office. That's about slaveholders. And they said, yeah, take it out. But it's a typical Douglass move to create an unforgettable metaphor. This is what he was so good at. Give the temperance movement over to the rum sellers. Redeemers come from the pit of hell, not from paradise. Oh, anyway. Back up with me. I just want to run you through a little bit of the trajectory of Douglass's life and ideas from when he was this young abolitionist who spoke right here in Lexington, still a Garrisonian by ideology and strategy, but becoming something else quickly. And then try to give you a sense of how this was a man, partly because he had no formal education, who was always changing. He wasn't trained in a particular school of thought, at whatever, the Harvard Law School, or the Frankfurt School of this and that. He had no school of thought except abolition. Not a day of his life ever in a schoolroom, which is one of the things that's always astonishing to people about this guy. And even his own lifetime, they'd hear him speak and they'd think, you can't be who you say you are. You can't be this brilliant and not have education. Well, he did have some education, and it was the 19th century. You couldn't do this today. But Douglass was the kind of kid who clearly people saw as bright, and they wanted him to do this and they wanted him to do that, except when his owner in Baltimore told his wife, stop teaching him to read because he's getting awfully good at it. And the next thing, they want to learn how to write. And the next thing, you can't keep him as a slave. And by the way, the day he heard Hugh Auld say that to Sophia Auld, it's one of my top 100 Douglass quotes. He said, when Master said that to Sophia, that was the first anti-slavery speech I ever heard. Because if he didn't want me to read and write, that probably is what I should figure out how to do. And it's a spark that was always with Douglass, against great odds, no doubt. But the kid was a sponge. And as he becomes a teenager, he's a bigger sponge. If he met you, he'd figure out what he can learn from you. Because he didn't have schools. You became his teacher. What do you got? Come on, what do you got? Teach me what you got. And when he got what he thought he could get out of you, he'd probably discard you, which is why he didn't keep friends very well. He also didn't trust very well. Why would a former slave who runs away in a world that could enslave him again at any minute trust anyone? He found trusting very difficult. But he learned from people. People were his schools. Experience were his schools. And when he met William Lloyd Garrison and the whole, that was a kind of a school of Garrisonian abolitionists, he found a bunch of people who were radically committed. I mean, they were committed radicals. These were mostly white, although there were black Garrisonians. Mostly these were white people, deeply religious, devoting their lives to destroying slavery. And once he became convinced they were on the level, they were his friends. More than that, they were his mentors. But pretty soon he learns, of course, by the time he came through Lexington in 1844, he's already beginning to have some problems with Garrison's principles and strategies. Garrison was a doctrinaire radical. And if you join Garrison's band, on the one hand, you joined a leader who had enormous charisma, brilliance as an organizer, deep biblical footing, although Garrison was not trained as a minister, and who would, bare his breast to anything and risk his life to end slavery. You followed that. But pretty soon you had to toe the line. You weren't supposed to be involved in politics at all because political parties were dirty business. You weren't supposed to believe in using the Constitution or using law because the Constitution was hopelessly and unequivocally pro-slavery. You were supposed to be strictly pacifist, or what they called non-resistant. And on the one hand, that can be a very impressive kind of position, but fugitive slaves had some trouble with that because of what they had lived through. Douglass had fought with his hands more than once. And with time, he comes to struggled mightily with the idea of the possibilities of violence and resistance to slavery. But with time, he comes to think, well, maybe, just maybe, you have to try to think about that. Garrison had other tenets you had to follow. And eventually Douglass begins to break with Mr. Garrison, broke with the Garrisonians. It wasn't overnight. It wasn't a road to Damascus. It was a process of experiences and new mentors. New mentors like Gerrit Smith in upstate New York, who especially drew Douglass into political anti-slavery. And another mentor, though they barely met once or twice, was the man whose book Douglass read. And Douglass, by the way, was a voracious reader. He starts his book collections in the 1840s, although it's very fledgling at first. He doesn't really start collecting books till the 1850s, and he had help with that. He eventually had a huge book collection, which is all today owned by the National Park Service, and out in Landover, Maryland, in those accordion shelves in a warehouse, they have Douglass's book collection, which is extraordinary. They let me go there. Oh, sorry. They let me go there for a whole day once and just play with the bookshelves. And I was frustrated because I was hoping to find enormous annotation, right? You want to find annotation in your man's books. He didn't write much in his books. Unlike me, I write every page in my post-its. It's junk all over my books. In the 19th century, books were so precious to people. They didn't always mark them. Anyway, but he started to read William Goodell. William Goodell is probably somebody you've never heard of. He was a radical abolitionist, deeply Christian, grew up in upstate New York. He became a Garrisonian abolitionist, although he soured on Garrison and left that tribe by the late 1840s. But Goodell was a doctrinaire political abolitionist who argued that you not only had to argue that the Constitution was anti-slavery, it was anti-slavery. And in this little book he wrote called they always had boring titles in the 19th century, Views of American Constitutional Law and Its Bearing Upon American Slavery. What Goodell did in this book, and Douglass, I don't know for sure the year Douglass picks it up, but it's probably around 1846, 47. Goodell went line by line, clause by clause through the United States Constitution and showed how virtually every word in it, that he overdid it, is anti-slavery. Now, we all know that the Constitution made compromises with slavery. Most egregious is the three-fifths compromise, three-fifths clause. We all know that the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which is your right to property and transport of property, was used by slaveholders to defend slavery. But you know what? That same Fifth Amendment is what gives you due process. Good God, the founders were laying out it was like a menu of contradictions in that Bill of Rights. Just pick your starter and your main meal. But Goodell was it's hard to describe. I mean, we've all known really doctrinaire radical reformers, maybe one or two in our lives. They're not always the most pleasant people. Not easy to go to lunch with because they're always telling you what you should be doing and you haven't done enough yet. And open your checkbook and you better be at this meeting. Be there or be square, you know. Goodell was like this. Maybe it's good that he didn't meet Goodell very often. But that book really changed Douglass. It gave Douglass now a serious, authentic way of seeing the U.S. Constitution as possibly that which you could use against slavery, to destroy it, to imagine a greater democracy, to imagine an equality. Now, today still, not just among constitutional law experts, but the general public, students come to us, and frankly, since the 1619 Project, there are good things in the 1619 Project, but one of its effects was to, again, send this message that the United States was so pro-slavery at its founding, it was just hopeless. And therefore, we had to have that Civil War. Boom, from 1787 to 1861, and forget what's in between. It misses so much to do that. The abolitionists took that Constitution, and particularly the Declaration of Independence, good Lord, that was an open invitation. Jefferson was sending an open invitation to anybody who wanted to use those 4 first principles. He might not have used them that way himself, but there they were. And then there's this Constitution. Douglass took his time, but when he comes back from England in 1847 to about 1850-51, a four-year time, he's in his late 20s and then 30 and 31 years old. 32. He begins to transform into an advocate of the anti-slavery Constitution. And by the middle of the 1850s, especially the later 1850s, he was probably its most fiercest advocate. Douglass began to argue that, first of all, there's the preamble. And by preamble, you ever read read the preamble to the Constitution? You hear about it. We are the people, in order to form perfect union, and then it all fades. The song just wilts away after that. But actually, have you ever read it? It says 6 things. And William Goodell spent pages on each of these. I mean, Douglass must have been overwhelmed. And by the way, Goodell was a bit crazy. But, you ever read the preamble? Its first principle was to create a more perfect union. Okay? Abolitionists began to think, well, maybe we can work with that. Second one was to establish justice. Ooh, justice. That's interesting. Third, to ensure domestic tranquility. In Goodell's book, you know what he does? He goes to dictionaries and he shows you definitions of what domestic and tranquility mean. And how it's totally antithetical to slavery. Fourth, to provide for the common defense. Security, stability in society. Goodell argues you can't have slavery and have domestic security to a huge swath of the population. Fifth, to promote the domestic welfare of whom, says Goodell? The people. Oh. And finally, number 6, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Yes, I know the founders, a significant proportion of the founders were pro-slavery. And by the way, sometimes lost in our claims about how pro-slavery the United States was at its founding, we do forget that there were New Englanders who hated certain aspects of the Constitution and wanted to vote against it, but knew they couldn't or they'd get no Constitution. The American Constitution in its founding is one of the greatest compromises in human history. And thank God they found a way, or there wouldn't have been a document to revise later and fight over later. That's where they began. And then there's the clause that says, Congress shall guarantee a Republican form of government to all the states. Oh. Goodell and then Douglass and all the other anti-slavery constitutionalists began to argue a Republican form of government? That means representation. Huge swath of this society is not represented. And on they went. They took the Fifth Amendment where it says you have a right to due process. They said, okay, other people can read the property part of that, but we choose to read the second part of it. Thank you very much. It's fascinating to stop and think that Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution divided America. We talk about being polarized today. Let's talk about real polarization. The part of the country that owned slaves said the Fifth Amendment can only mean the right to property. The anti-slavery side of the country said no. It means all human beings have a right to due process. And a slave, by definition, has no due process. Now, I say all of this just because I've written a long paper on Douglass and the anti-slavery Constitution. It's my first ever publication in a law journal. By the way, how many lawyers in the audience? Okay, good. The way you do footnotes is ridiculous. I couldn't believe it. They want every word footnoted. Huh. Sorry. Now, Douglass began to also do with the Constitution in the interest of trying to imagine a greater democracy what he did with abolitionist rhetoric altogether. We may be aware in this room of his most famous speech, the 4th of July speech in 1852. If not, that's okay. But read it before you go to bed tonight. It's signed. It's the rhetorical masterpiece of American rhetoric before the Civil War, maybe the whole 19th century. It's a symphony in 3 movements. It's an absolutely gorgeous work of rhetorical art. But it's one of the most penetrating analyses of this American contradiction and hypocrisy of slavery and freedom in a republic. But he did this 1,000 other places. In the wake of the Dred Scott decision, the horrible Dred Scott decision, if you had any sympathy with anti-slavery in 1857, the decision that said black people now have no future in America. Justice Taney's argument was, quote, black people have no rights, quote unquote, that white people, and he racialized it, ever should acknowledge. In Douglass's speech on the Dred Scott case, which is on one level quite despairing in the wake of the decision, he also said this. He said, the opening of the Constitution, meaning the preamble, says, we the people, not we the white people. not we the citizens or the legal voters, not we the privileged class, and excluding all other classes but we, the people, not we the horses and cattle, but we the people, the men and the women, the human inhabitants of the United States do ordain and establish this Constitution. Give Douglass a little opening. Give him a phrase, and he will take you somewhere. He became in his own way what law school people would call an originalist. But his original Constitution was anti-slavery now. And he's going to be a ferocious originalist to the second Constitution. All right, I can't stop on everything I wanted to say tonight, but I will do just two other little things. Of course, the war itself transformed many things about this prospect of democracy. We probably are all, at least some degree, aware that emancipation comes out of a process of history and policy making. Yes, it came by military necessity, a phrase Lincoln actually used, but it also came by a decision to do it and to order the American Army and Navy to free slaves. That became the revolution at the heart of Douglass's life. He's 45 years old at the time. He's 44. A month later, he's going to be 45 at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. Middle of his life, right? How many reformers, how many radical reformers actually lived to see the triumph of their cause in midlife? Now, it happened in the Civil Rights Movement. For a lot of younger radicals, they saw the 64 Civil Rights Act. They saw the 65 Civil Rights Act. Some of them were in the Oval Office of the White House with LBJ when he signed the thing. And sometimes LBJ didn't get the right credit for that. Name me a single decision by an American president in the interest of racial equality more courageous than LBJ's. Now, you could say subsequent presidents didn't have to face that. It's true. But for an old segregationist racist from Texas, holy whatever, as my dad would have said. But then out of the war comes what? It comes this challenge that is still hard to get your head around. You know, bless their soul, the Atlantic devoted an entire issue recently to Reconstruction. And I put Mr. D on the cover. It's a drawing based on a photo of him from 1863. Douglass has made the cover of the Atlantic in 2023. Man, is that cool or what? But Reconstruction was, of course, unprecedented. Where did they go in the Constitution in 1865 to, or even before that, during the war, to say, okay, this democracy just destroyed itself in horrific civil war. Here's where you go in the Constitution to find the design to put it back together. There was no design. They had to make one. They had to make it up. And there were all kinds of battles and fights, and the 14th Amendment is in many ways the greatest result of those fights. So is the 15th, although, by the way, Douglass initially opposed both the 14th and 15th Amendments because they were just full of compromises that were way too namby-pamby for him. But classic move by Douglass and so many other abolitionists, they realized it's the best they were going to get. Douglass had learned his politics throughout the 1850s. I didn't dwell on that here, but it took time for him to learn that great art or craft of pragmatism. Maybe you can get this, but you can't get that. But if you can get this, it might lead to that. Young people today don't like compromises. I understand. Actually, no, sometimes I don't. And I want to grab them by their lapels and say, vote! But I'm nice. I don't quite grab them by the, I don't grab anybody by the lapel. But here they are. They're reinventing an American Union. They're reinventing a U.S. Constitution. They do it through the 13th, ending slavery, the 14th, equality before law, and the 15th Amendment's the right to vote for black men, designed largely to get the black male vote in the South, and that actually worked by 1870. It worked in 68 as well. They also passed the first Civil Rights Act in American history in 1866, which was a heck of a beginning and a remarkable turn in American jurisprudence. And then they passed 4 Reconstruction Acts and put the South under control, military control, for the next 2 to 3 years, depending on which state we're talking about, 4 years. And they tried, they being the existing Republican Party of the Civil War era. And here's a thought to think about, too. Douglass is not an elected official, but he's very much a Republican. And he would be the rest of his life. Sometimes against the odds, sometimes against the next generation of young black leadership who are always trying to knock him off. Lo and behold, all generations are the same. The man who's on the pedestal, they want to knock him off. And the next generation of young black leadership tended to all be college educated and free-born. Not all of them, but most of them. Guys went to college, they went to Oberlin, they went to Harvard, for God's sake. And here's this old Douglass, the old hayseed, who's supposed to be the greatest thing since Jesus. And they attack him and attack him and attack him. But for Douglass, he's a Republican the rest of his life because he had nowhere else to go. And because that party had brought about emancipation, had brought about the 14th Amendment, had rewritten the Constitution, had made it possible to imagine a new democracy. I want to wrap this with one other example of what Douglass did, and it tells us something again about hope, I think, although I'm not terribly hopeful these days. Without question, the most hopeful moment in Frederick Douglass's public life, it's a different matter when you're talking about his private life. In his public life, the most hopeful time was essentially between 1866, the year of the 14th Amendment, the year the Republicans wrested control of Reconstruction away from Andrew Johnson, and were in control of this process, from about 1866 to 69-70. It's a short period, it's a short window. But Douglass became so hopeful in that period, it seemed to him like not only had the revolution been won, but they were remaking the country. And they were remaking it, again, there are a lot of compromises that aren't what he would have done. You know, or as colleagues have sometimes said to me, when you collaborate writing with somebody, your colleague says, yeah, it's all right. Not what I would have written. Yeah, I know. You didn't write it, I did. So sign up. Anyway, but that period, Douglass had the audacity to believe the United States truly had remade itself, and it ought to even export its ideas. He became a kind of a soft imperialist. He became an advocate of taking the 14th Amendment, really, or taking this idea of racial equality out to the world, take it to the Caribbean, take it to all places where people are still living under quasi-slavery or slavery, especially dark peoples, African peoples, brown peoples, wherever. And you can read some Douglass rhetoric that sounds like, ooh, God, man, he became quite an imperialist here. He wants the U.S. to expand, expand, expand. He wrote a speech. It's one of his most remarkable, it's a short speech. You can pull it up online. You can read this one before bed tonight, too. It's called The Composite Nation. Now, The Composite Nation, he first wrote it, I believe, in 1867. peak of radical Reconstruction, peak of this hopefulness. The version we have of it, he gave in 1869. He's still giving it here and there in 1870. I could find no example of him ever giving it again in the 1870s because of what happened to with the retreat from Reconstruction. And it just didn't fit in. But here was, in essence, this speech. Composite nation. I wish I had 20 minutes to develop it for you. But what he did was this. He talked about how America now had the chance to become and was becoming the great pluralistic nation, bringing peoples from all corners of the earth, all colors, all religions, all ethnicities into one place, living under this new constitution with equality before law and having the opportunity to do what no other country had ever done. A real democracy of equality with this crazy mix of Earth's peoples. In fact, he even gave a definition of what a nation ought to be now. Listen to his definition. A nation, Douglass says, quote, and you could substitute this for a definition of democracy. He said, it implies a willing surrender and subjection of individual aims and ends, often narrow and selfish, to the broader and better ones that arise out of society as a whole. It is both a sign and the result of civilization. Giving up your personal urges, your personal wishes, your personal needs. What have you done for me lately? In the interest of the whole. Now, that's such a cliche today, right? Teach that to young people and they'll roll their eyes at you. And he goes on about what an amazing collection of just wildly weird people are coming to America. The speech all but sings, that old song by Neil Diamond, they're coming to America. Maybe, did Neil Diamond write that? I don't know. And then about a third of the way into the speech, he pauses and he changes he sort of changes the subject to Chinese immigration. It's becoming a huge issue in the late 1860s into the 70s. Chinese are coming into California, larger and larger numbers. They're getting involved they're part of the labor of the transcontinental railroads. A lot of problems with this, but Douglass says, let them come. He makes this robust case for Chinese immigration. He says, what are you afraid of, white people? He addresses the audience as white people at one point, which was not usual for him. But he said, yeah, they have a strange religion. They have all kinds of religions. They have strange languages. Yeah, they're alien. But he uses a model, not surprisingly, of assimilation. He says, look, our institutions are now so designed, 14th Amendment, our institutions can now be so designed that modernity, and he constantly talks about modernity. He doesn't use the word modernity, we do, but he talks about transportation is changing the world, technology is changing the world, space is being conquered, time is being conquered. And he says, you too are being conquered in your prejudices. Get ready. And then he does a Douglass. He starts floating all these metaphors. They're coming over the rivers. They're coming over the mountains. They're coming into the valleys. They're coming to your cities. Get the welcoming clubs out. Chinese are coming. Now, there hasn't been a Chinese Exclusion Act yet. The first one came in 1874. It was against women. The full, total Chinese Exclusion Act didn't come until 1882. But Douglass uses Chinese immigration to say to people, get real. America's going to become Chinese too. But he tries to make everybody, comfortable by saying, look, they're going to learn English. They may or may not convert to Christianity or whatever. But it's the assimilation model. And he can bank on it because he thinks our laws have been so changed that everyone will adapt to them. And then he spends the last third of the speech. Douglass was brilliant at speeches of 3 parts. You know, the old rule. Don't use more than 3 examples. People can't understand it. And the last part of the speech becomes this beautiful description, basically, of pluralism and of the greatness of natural rights and the commonality of human beings, composite nation. If you could just stop history in 1869, listen to that speech. Don't teach young people anything that's happened ever since. Whew. It's like there was a Shangri-La. No, there wasn't, but could there have been? Okay. There are, again, 100 other ways to express democracy through Douglass's great rhetoric. I'll stand with this. He took his strength rhetorically and intellectually from the Hebrew prophets. If any of you bought this book tonight, I put the word prophet in the subtitle of my book. Now, that was not an easy choice. In fact, I was scared of that word. Prophet's a big word. You shouldn't use it calmly or softly. We use the word prophetic, like popcorn sometimes. Oh, that was prophetic. It seemed like he said something predictive. That's not prophecy. And when I was working on this book, I kept thinking, Douglass's language, his power with words seems prophetic. Now, I had no formal theological training, although I've always loved theology. I love reading about theology in different traditions. So I started to talk to my friends who were theologians, both Christian and Jewish. Don Shriver, who used to be president of Union Theological Seminary, took me and set me down once at lunch in New York City for 2.5 hours. Said, David, here's what you got to do. You got to read Walter Brueggemann. He named about 8 other authors. You especially got to read Walter Brueggemann, who only wrote 40 books. But I read a lot of Walter Brueggemann on the prophetic tradition. And then I have a good friend in New Haven who's a rabbi, Jim Honent. He used to be head rabbi at Yale. He and his wife used to come to my lecture class, sit in the front row, and always hang around afterward and want to have lunch. And I got to know him very well. He learned my dilemma with Douglass and this word prophetic. David, sit down. You got to read Abraham Heschel, the great, maybe the greatest 20th century Jewish theologian who wrote many, many books, but especially that giant tome called The Prophets, which was Heschel's deep analysis of who and what the Hebrew prophets may have been. And Douglas's 2 favorite prophets were Isaiah and Jeremiah, and he had others. But Isaiah and Jeremiah are all over his rhetoric. There's almost no major Douglass speech that doesn't use Isaiah, even late in life. So I read a lot of Heschel, and I began to read these descriptions of Heschel describing what the prophets really are or were. Prophets, said Heschel, are those who can use language to shatter us in order to change us. The words of prophets, said Heschel, are not souvenirs. They are painful. You may or may not survive them. He said the words of prophets often work at a different octave, and only some of us can hear them. And Heschel went on and on, these beautiful chapters and descriptions of how prophets are the people in any time, or for that matter, any tradition, who find language to explain what's happening to us. The language that we can't find. They have an ability to
think, speak, and write about what's going on in history and to us that we can't find, but they managed to. And the more and more and more I read, the more I began to see in Heschel's writing, oh my God, that's Douglass. That's Douglass. That's Douglass. And I'll just kind of leave you there, but this way. One of the reasons Douglass's rhetoric or speeches or his writings, and by the way, he wrote millions of words, hundreds and hundreds of the short form editorials in his newspaper. He mastered that form. He wrote 1,200 pages of autobiography at 3 different times. A different form. And then there are the speeches. Dozens and dozens and dozens of speeches, which, by the way, every major Douglass speech exists in a text. He didn't just get up in churches and halls and blow out the lights off the top of his head. He wrote it all down. He would travel with 2 or 3 different speeches, so he'd have the text with him. He didn't always speak from the text. But words were his weapon. And he is one of those writers. There are a lot of them. You can read the rest of your life and find your own times, your own self, your own problems, and clearly your country in the words. So when our democracy is collapsing in the next year, go read some Douglass. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful. And
Questions? You want to take any?
do you want to take questions? It is 8:25, and there may be more book signing. But take questions. Take questions.
Anyone who's a glutton for punishment, please. Yes, sir, in the back row.
First of all, I'm halfway through your book because we want to thank you for this portrait in so many dimensions.
He gets more interesting as he gets older. Anyway, go ahead.
Between history and progress, unable to comprehend their place in history, and even the patriotic significance of the act of voting. And what would you hope they or those of us here take from Mr. Douglass's private struggle and public discourse around that tension?
Whoa. You know what? That reminds me of the questions they would write for our prelim exams in graduate school. At the end, it would say, discuss. Well, I can't answer all of those. I don't have an answer necessarily. I've thought that if people struggle, if they're being asked, you know, what do you think of patriotism? Or patriotism? If they're struggling with that, it could have something to do with how the very idea of selfless patriotism has been so sullied, soiled, abused, laughed at, that they don't know what to say about it. I don't have any data on that, by the way, but that would be a surmise. I'll give you this too. The last sentence of Douglass's long-form masterpiece, some of his greatest piece of writing, is his second autobiography called My Bondage and My Freedom, 1855, 440-page, much expanded version of the first autobiography. And you can see on the page him struggling. How am I going to end this? We've all written endings or read a lot of endings, and they're a struggle. He ends by saying, and I'm partly paraphrasing, as long as heaven allows me to do this work. It's 1855. Think of the moment. Nebraska Act's been passed. Bleeding Kansas is happening. violent rescues of fugitive slaves are happening around the country. Oh my goodness, the political parties are tearing themselves apart. What does Douglass say? As long as heaven allows me to do this work, I will do it with my voice, my pen, and my vote. That's how he ends it. Now, for him, that's all he had. He doesn't hold office. He doesn't have wealth. He's got a voice, a pen, a hell of a voice, a hell of a pen. And he says, I have a vote. I've always found it, to me, remarkable that he added that word vote. At a time when most black people obviously couldn't vote. In fact, in his state of New York, you had to own, was it $250 or $350 worth of property to be able to vote. White people did not. Possibly part of the answer to your question is that the very idea of voting has to some degree been sullied. There's been so much voter suppression that people either engage in or deny or fight against. Why don't we vote on Sunday? Why don't we make registering to vote the simplest possible thing in citizenship? There's so many ways to increase voter participation, but look, be honest, we have one political party that does not want to do that. So, my voice, my pen, my vote. Now, that's all most of us have, unless you have great wealth, which can lead to power. You have a voice. We don't all have a pen either. We can't all, write op-eds. We don't have enough newspapers anymore. But we have a vote. Yes. Yeah.
Very quick question. What is the quote that you did send for the amicus brief? You told us the one you didn't. I want to know the one you
I'd
did.
have to look it up. Honestly, can't remember. No. I thought it was. I didn't choose it. She loves Douglass. I don't recall the exact passage, but it was kind of Douglass on the rule of law. It was a safe. He believed in rule of law. That was a safe thing to say. And he believed that disqualifying rebels and insurrectionists was a good idea. So anyway, Douglass. I mean, again, couldn't put this in the amicus brief, but Douglass was very fun. He used this a lot of times. He said, insurrection? Slavery is an insurrection. Let's begin with that, was Douglass's approach. And one of the things, the concept of insurrection, and one of the things the court, Supreme Court, is going to be tussling over. They got a tough call on this one. I'm not crying for them, but what is insurrection? And did he do it? They may find that as an end run. They got a couple other possible methods, like the passage in the 14th Amendment that says, if you took an oath as an officer of the federal government, you violated that oath and you joined the insurrection or the rebellion, you'll never hold office again. Well, defenders of the other side are arguing it doesn't name the president. If the president is not an officer of the federal government, then who is? In fact, he's the only officer who speaks for everyone. So, but that, in legal technicalities, could be another way around it. The court is probably, you didn't ask, but the court is probably going to find some way to turn around the Colorado Supreme Court decision as a means of stopping the process of states taking any candidate off the ballot, because that could lead to a patchwork of electoral, some say chaos, some might say democracy.
Thank you so much. The Lexington Lyceum advocates would like to hear from you. If you want more about Reconstruction, other topics, democracy, let us know. We are doing more on Frederick Douglass on February 14th, his birthday, or the birthday he chose. We're going to have another Frederick Douglass Day, and it's going to be a national day. It's going to be right here with our friends again, the Lexington Historical Society and ABCL. We're going to be transcribing Douglass's own words. And it's going to be run partly through this Douglass Day system. Look at our website and let us hear from you. If you like this program, let us know what you want next. Anyway, thank you so much, and thank you, David.